Story 1. So this happened like 9–10 years ago when I was 7 or 8 years old. I was a scout back then and a part of a group which was, for the most part, filled with friends and people I knew. I was popular because back then I was social and easygoing. I was friends with everyone and everyone was friends with me and everyone else. But, as always, there's one exception to this. In all honesty, the entitled kid was a dumb brat. He would yell, he would fight, he would make others cry. He did what he wanted. Back then, I thought he was special, and that's why I tried to be friends with him. But nope, later in life, when we went to the same high school, I learned that he was just dumb. Like I said, that kid would always be trying to get into fights with everyone. People were sick of it, and in time, so was I. I don't remember clearly what the brat did to deserve a shouting from me. He was probably harassing girls or hitting boys, but I flipped on him. Now, at this time, he didn't take out his knife or begin to cry. Instead, he just stopped shouting and stopped whatever he was doing. For the rest of the day, he would just sit at the back of our cabin and just stare at me, menacingly. So, let's skip a week ahead in time. It was the next scout session, don't know what else to call it, and things were going well. We were doing something time-consuming, so everyone's attention was at the thing they were doing, whatever that was. The entitled kid, of course, wasn't doing anything, and instead he decided it was better to run around the cabin. Scout leader tried her best to stop the madness, but that only fueled the kid's rampage. While on his rampage, it didn't take long for him to find the door to the log cabin that was next to the main cabin, and when he did, well, things hit the fan hard. I was sitting next to the cabin, and I could hear everything he did and said there clearly. Entitled kid, oh my. He started whispering from the log cabin. Joel, that's me. Come here for a second. At first I thought, what is he doing now? But I soon became curious. He wouldn't stop whispering, and I kinda wanted to know what the bugger had found. So, like the stupid kid I was, I went there. Me. Yeah, what is it? I got something to show you. After a bit of searching, I found him at the back of the cabin. Now, at this time, I thought he was going to apologize for being a jerk to everyone, and I was quite ecstatic. I knew this would be a story I would milk out, something to brag to my friends. I was so intimidating that he apologized to me. Well, I got a story out of it, but not the one I was hoping. Me. What's you got there, buddy? His back was turned against me, and I didn't see what he was hiding or doing. After I asked him what he was doing, he turned around. You see this, Joel? I couldn't see what he had in his hand, but I saw his twisted grin. I can't see it. Could you bring it closer? Sure. And now I saw it, a dull, red handle knife. Do you see it now, Joel? Now, at this point, I said something along the lines of, oh no, or what the, and booked it out of there, with the jerk laughing maniacally behind me. I ran out of the log cabin into the main cabin and tripped. This diverted the leader's attention, who now noticed that the entitled kid was gone and that I was on the cabin floor, panicking. Leader. What's wrong, Joel? Where's the entitled kid? Me. It's him. That wanker got a knife. Yep, I said wanker. That one I remember vividly. What? He's trying to gut me. It took a moment for the leader to realize what was happening, but when she did, she ran into the log cabin, fuming. My friends came closer and asked me what had happened, but before I could answer them, I heard the leader scream at the entitled kid. What makes you think it's okay to threaten someone with a knife? I wasn't, I was just showing it. Well, what makes you think you have any right to hold one without a supervisor? You could have not only hurt yourself, you could have hurt Joel. I swear, Get out of here. Go outside and wait for your mom to come pick you up. She then came back into the main cabin and told one of the other leaders to look after us. She then went outside with the entitled kid and waited for the mother to come pick the little devil up. Now, according to what I had heard, the leader told the others after this incident, the mother was furious. A complete and utter entitled mother who tried to tell the leader that I was probably the aggressor and that I was a son of a witch. At the time, I laughed at this with my friends, But had I known she would come for me the next week, I wouldn't have been laughing. In order for you guys to understand better where me and my friends were when this happened, here is the main cabin. Now, a week after the incident, me and my friends were on top of the bridge you can see in front of the building. We were messing around, doing dumb stuff, playing tag, stuff like that, when suddenly, the entitled mother showed up. The conversation goes something like this. Entitled mother, which one of you is Joel? Me. Here, ma'am. You're the one who bullied my darling. What? I then noticed the entitled kid on the back seat, bawling his eyes out. Oh, you're the entitled kid's mom. Yeah, he tried to slice me with a knife. He would never. She then went on to list some positive things about him, which seemed pretty nonsense to me and my friends. He's a gentleman, yet he harassed little girls. He's great at school, yet he couldn't be bothered to pay attention for a single second. That, and he was a F&D student in high school, so he's got more friends than any of you. Yet he had somehow become an outcast in our scout group. I honestly got bored at her rambling and went back to playing with my friends. Some of them kept shouting at her, others ignored her. One of my friends, a girl I had known since kindergarten, started straight up roasting this 30-year-old woman. I can't remember what she shouted, but I remember the entitled mother's reaction. Shut up, you witch, this ain't none of your business. Now this didn't stop my friend. In fact, it fueled her rage even more. Knowing what kind of woman her mother was, this didn't surprise me one bit. As time went on, one of the leaders noticed the commotion and came to check what's going on. The entitled mother noticed this and got out of there, fast. After the leader asked us what had happened, and we told him, he went and told the main leader, and she was furious. She went and straight up banned the entitled kid, a ban which was lifted just 3 years ago in 2016, when the entitled kid wanted back into the scout group. My career as a scout had already come to an end in 2011, so it didn't bother me. Story 2. In memory of my late mother, who passed away peacefully after living an amazing life, I'd like to share one of my favorite stories from her time as a nurse. Back in the 1980s, she worked extra shifts for the Trauma Intervention Program Services TIPS, where professional nurses acted as grief counselors. They would ride with ambulances or arrive on site to support individuals who had experienced traumatic events. One evening, my mom was called to a hotel where parents had just faced a violent reaction involving their 8-year-old child. I don't have all the details, unfortunately. She was on site comforting the mother while the emergency medical technicians EMS were struggling emotionally after the child tragically passed just as they arrived. The lead EMS, Bruce, was a large, imposing figure 6'2", 230 pounds, with a thick Magnum PI-style mustache and a stern demeanor. Despite his tough exterior, my mom always said he was a teddy bear when out of uniform. The ambulance was parked outside the hotel's main entrance at an angle, with the rear sticking into the valet area. This position was chosen to avoid blocking guests, while still maintaining emergency access. Everyone in the hotel who was aware of the situation, both staff and guests, was somber due to the events of the evening. While Bruce was escorting the coroner upstairs, my mom stayed downstairs consoling the devastated parents. Suddenly, an entitled man pulled up in a Jaguar and decided to park directly behind the angled ambulance, leaving only inches between his car and the emergency vehicle. Seeing this, my mother got up to ask the man to move his car, as it wasn't in the designated valet area. Instead of cooperating, the entitled man immediately cursed her out and stormed inside to the bar to meet his party. The one remaining valet frantically tried to get the man's keys to move the vehicle, but the entitled man stopped only to curse out both the valet and my mom for daring to speak to him before disappearing inside. The valet went in to report the situation, and my mother returned to the grieving parents to continue offering comfort. After the coroner finished their work, Bruce and his partner began packing up the ambulance, but they were visibly upset about the Jaguar blocking their vehicle. As they were about to leave, a commotion erupted at the hotel entrance. Security, the general manager, and the valet were all escorting the entitled man out of the building. He was shouting and shoving his way through security, insisting he could not be treated this way. He claimed to be a big deal at some corporation and demanded not to be manhandled. A side note, my mom always found Owen Wilson's character in Night at the Museum hilarious because of his use of the word manhandled. Apparently, the entitled man had pieced together that the emergency involved the coroner's vehicle and made a callous comment, saying something along the lines of, "Well, there's no emergency now, is there? No one's hurt." He was completely unaware that the child's grieving parents were standing just across the valet station. Hearing this, Bruce dropped his clipboard with a loud thud. He marched up the hotel stairs, directly to the entitled man, turned him around, and punched him square in the face in front of everyone. The entitled man stumbled back and fell to the ground. Without hesitation, Bruce leaned over him, his face resembling a boxer's after delivering a knockout blow, and calmly said, "Now someone is hurt." There were a few more words exchanged, though my mom couldn't recall them exactly, but Bruce made it clear, "Go call for emergency services, because I'm not helping you. Now move your car." He stormed down the stairs, and as he passed my mom, she saw the scariest look she'd ever seen on his face. It was a moment she never forgot, and it serves as a reminder of how deeply some situations can affect even the most composed individuals. Story 3. My uncle has always been a self-righteous, petty man with a bad temper and an inflated sense of his own importance, but very little common sense. My dad, on the other hand, always tried to keep the peace, valuing family above all else. This is the story of how my uncle finally pushed my dad too far and ended up getting arrested for his trouble. It's a bit lengthy, as it covers several months of an ongoing feud between them. To provide some background, my dad and uncle are neighbors in a small rural community of about 600 people. My dad built the house that my uncle now lives in, then sold it to him along with a small plot of land. My dad still owns about 6 acres that run along the side and back of my uncle's smaller property. My uncle works as a dealer for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning HVAC units. My dad, also in the HVAC business, would occasionally buy from his brother, even though my uncle's prices were higher and his inventory more limited than other dealers. My dad did this to help him out. He also rented a building from my uncle, using it as his shop and office. The lease only included the building and parking lot, but both of them would store old HVAC units in the field behind the property. These old units were rusty and unattractive, but when they had spare time, they'd break them down for scrap. The story begins when one day, my dad went to my uncle needing a specific HVAC unit. My uncle quoted him a high price and couldn't deliver it on time. So, my dad called another dealer who had the unit available for a much lower price. My dad went with the better option, a no-brainer. My uncle found out about this apparently. The HVAC business can be as gossipy as a high school cafeteria, and confronted my dad, giving him an ultimatum. Either my dad bought 100% of his units from him, or he wouldn't sell him anything at all. I already mentioned that my uncle isn't the brightest. So, my dad didn't say much, but took him at his word and stopped buying from him. A month later, my uncle showed up at my dad's shop, demanding to know why my dad hadn't ordered anything that month. When my dad explained, my uncle lost his temper. They had a heated argument, which ended with my uncle announcing that my dad was no longer his brother, they wouldn't do business together anymore, and that my dad was evicted from the shop. Legally, my dad wasn't actually evicted, as that would require a formal notice and a specific waiting period. But my dad had had enough and decided to convert the barn at his house into a new shop. My uncle, realizing his bluff had been called, returned a few days later to inform my dad that he also needed to remove all the old HVAC units scattered around the field, or he would sue my dad for the cost of their removal. Legally, my uncle had no grounds for this, as my dad's lease only covered the building, not the field, and both of them had been using the old units as shared property. However, when my dad gets angry, he really gets angry. He agreed to move the old units. So, using his tractor, He loaded the rusty HVAC units onto a trailer and meticulously arranged them an inch or two off the property line at the back of my uncle's house. My dad couldn't see them from his house, but my uncle had a perfect view of the rusted eyesores in his backyard. Around this time, my uncle started spying on my dad, always watching from his windows. My dad, tired of being watched, decided to build a privacy fence along the side of his property that bordered my uncle's land. The fence builders started their work, and after a few hours, my uncle screeched into his driveway, jumped out of his truck, and began yelling. The fence workers had temporarily placed some tools on his side of the property line. My uncle called the police, who came and told the workers to keep their things on my dad's property and left. The next day, one of the workers accidentally left a hammer on my uncle's side of the line. Cue another meltdown. My uncle called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the hammer had been moved, and the officers were growing increasingly annoyed with him. Later that same day, my uncle called the police a third time. This time, he claimed that my dad had stolen a backhoe attachment for a tractor. However, my uncle had given it to my dad 2 years earlier, as my uncle didn't even own a tractor big enough to use it. The same officer, who had been to the house earlier, was even less amused when she learned this. My dad, unfazed, told my uncle, "Come get the backhoe if you want it." Knowing full well that my uncle had no way to transport it, my dad wasn't worried. At this point, my uncle claimed that my dad was trying to set a trap so that he could accuse him of trespassing if he came to retrieve the backhoe. He then tried to file a police complaint that would function similarly to a restraining order, stating that my dad was a habitual trespasser. The officer explained that even if my uncle invited my dad over in the future, my dad could still get in trouble if my uncle later called the police to report him for trespassing. In response, my dad decided to file the same complaint against his brother. Now comes the revenge. My dad knew that his brother had no real idea where the property lines were and wouldn't bother checking the survey. My dad, however, knew the exact boundaries and kept markers, called stobs, along his property lines. When my uncle went away for a few days, my dad moved all the old HVAC units a few feet further onto his own land and shifted the stobs back the same distance. This made it look as though the property line was further back than it really was. He then placed a random piece of scrap just over the fake property line and set up game cameras aimed at the area. As expected, my uncle noticed the scrap on what he thought was his side of the property line, stormed outside, and called the police. My dad was ready. He showed the officers his property survey, the footage from the game cameras showing my uncle trespassing, and a copy of the police report from earlier. It was my uncle who ended up getting arrested. The icing on the cake? The officer who arrested him was someone my uncle and dad had gone to high school with, which made the situation even more embarrassing for my uncle, especially in a small town where everyone knows each other. Edited to add, nothing major came from my uncle's arrest, as far as my dad knows, but the humiliation of being handcuffed, spending a night in jail, and having people know about it seemed to be enough. My uncle hasn't caused any more trouble for my dad, aside from existing and occasionally driving by. My uncle, aunt, cousin, and cousin's wife all unfriended me on social media, so now I only hear about them through small-town gossip. Recently, my sister waved at my uncle as she passed by his house, and he pretended not to recognize her. We didn't even get an announcement when my cousin's wife had her baby. It seems we're all dead to my uncle and his family, but he's too afraid to actually do anything beyond pretending we don't exist. Story 4. I'll start by giving some context. I live in the UK, where it's illegal to operate a petrol pump if you're under 16, and you can take your driving test starting at 17. The small town I grew up in had just one petrol station with 2 pumps. Sometimes there was a short wait, but being such a small town, it was rarely an issue. At the time, I had just passed my driving test and had been driving for a couple of weeks. When you pass, they give you a temporary paper license until the official one arrives by post. This temporary license doesn't have a photo, just your name, address, and other details. You might already be able to guess where this is going, so here's the story. It was an early Wednesday morning, and I decided to drive to school. My car was almost out of fuel, so I stopped by the petrol station to put in my usual £5 as a broke student. I could never afford to fill up the tank completely, so I often visited the station. That day, there was a new server behind the counter, likely just starting their job. One of the pumps was out of order, leaving only one operational pump in the whole town. I pulled up to the pump, and there was just one car behind me. After putting a small amount of petrol in the tank, I went inside to pay. As I approached the counter, I noticed the attendant giving me an odd look. Our conversation went something like this. Attendant, sorry, but can I see some ID? Me, I don't have any photo ID with me. Attendant, well, I can't sell petrol to someone who might be under 16. A little taken aback, I replied, I drove a car in here, and you have to be 17 to drive. Isn't that proof enough? Attendant, I'm sorry, but without ID, I can't do anything. Me, I can get my paper license from the car, but it doesn't have a photo on it. Attendant, it needs to be photo ID, otherwise I can't verify it's really you. Me, right, well, I live just a few minutes away. I can come back with my passport. Attendant, okay, but you'll have to leave your car here. I can't let you drive off without paying. I was absolutely dumbfounded. It was only a few minutes drive back home, but walking would take at least 20 minutes, meaning a 40-minute round trip. Not wanting to walk that long for the sake of £5 worth of petrol, I tried one last time. Me, it's going to take me 40 minutes to get my ID. Can you really not sell me this £5 of petrol? Attendant, I'm afraid not. It's not up to me. Seeing no other option, I said, okay, I'll leave my car here and come back in 40 minutes with my ID. I left the garage as instructed, leaving my car parked right in front of the only working petrol pump in town. 20 minutes later, I arrived home. By this point, I was thirsty, and since I had some time before school, I decided to make myself a cup of tea and maybe have a second breakfast. I always left early for school to get an hour or two of work done before classes started, so I figured I had some spare time. All the while, I knew my car was still locked and parked in front of the only operational pump in town. After about 15 minutes, having finished my tea and breakfast, I grabbed my passport and headed back out the door. Almost an hour after leaving the petrol station, I returned, passport in hand. By now, there was a queue of 10 to 15 cars, and the attendant looked panicked, trying to explain to the increasingly frustrated customers why they'd been waiting for nearly an hour to fill up. Just as I arrived, the manager of the station showed up. I explained to the manager that I'd left the car because I wasn't allowed to pay for the petrol without ID, and without paying for it, I couldn't drive the car away. Long story short, the station ended up issuing over £200 in free petrol to the waiting customers as compensation, and from that day on, I was never asked for ID again. Edit 1. Some people have asked why I didn't just drive off and leave the money with them or call the police. I was young and naive. I didn't want to drive off and risk any repercussions, and I'd been brought up to understand that you only call the police in an emergency. This didn't feel urgent enough to involve them. Also, it was the only petrol station within about 5 miles, so I didn't want to risk being banned. Edit 2. For those wondering, yes, it was a standard UK petrol pump where the attendant authorizes the pump before you fill up, and then you pay afterward. I didn't realize that might be unusual elsewhere. Edit 3. When you pass your driving test in the UK, you hand over your provisional license, which they send off to the licensing authority along with the necessary paperwork to get your full license. Your pass certificate acts as a temporary license until the official one arrives, and it's all you're supposed to need in the meantime. Otherwise, you'd have to handle the paperwork yourself. Story 5. In 2003, I returned home after my first year of college. I had decided to switch schools and degrees, opting to attend a local music technical college instead. I moved back in with my parents and drove into the city each day for classes. To save on parking costs, I purchased a permit to park in a church's lot about 10 blocks from the school, meaning I had a decent walk every day. About a week into classes, while on my walk and smoking a cigarette, a homeless man suddenly appeared beside me. He looked exactly as you might expect late 50s, with messy salt and pepper hair, wearing a flannel jacket, snow pants, and work boots without laces. He leaned in and asked, "Hey buddy, can I get a smoke?" At the time, I was 19, a bit cocky, and felt like making him work for it. I told him he could have one, but he'd have to walk with me to class and keep me company while he smoked it. He agreed, and off we went. We exchanged names and basic small talk about our lives, the usual pleasantries. A block from school, we tossed our cigarette butts, and he leaned in again, saying, "Hey buddy, I gotta ask, got any spare change?" I replied, "Sorry, but I don't keep change on me." At the time, I used to toss all my spare change into glass milk jugs I kept in my room. We parted ways that day. I kid you not, 2 weeks later, this man had memorized my class schedule. Every single day, he would meet me at the corner, ask for a cigarette, and walk with me to class. And every day, he'd ask me for spare change. And every day, I had none. This continued for almost 15 months. The school I went to didn't have summer breaks. Now, just a few weeks before graduation, it's late winter, and I'm getting ready for class. I put on my leather trench coat, grab my book bag, and head for the door. I glance down and see 2 glass milk jugs overflowing with change. I look at my coat's huge pockets, then back at the change jars. I'm going to do it. I took each milk jar, turned them upside down into my pockets, and let me tell you, you wouldn't believe how heavy 2 gallons of change actually are. Then I set off for school. Things started off like normal. He met me at the corner, I gave him a cigarette, and we walked together. I tried my best to step lightly so my pockets wouldn't jingle, and I avoided looking him in the face so I wouldn't burst out laughing. We finally reached the end of our walk, tossed our cigarettes, and he turned to me. "Hey buddy, I gotta ask, you got any change?" I turned to him and said, "All right, I'm going to make you a deal. I'll give you all the change I have in my pockets if you promise to never ask me for change again. Deal?" He nodded his head and held out one hand, palm up. "No, you don't understand," I said. "I have a lot of change." So, he held out both hands, cupping them together. "No," I repeated, "you don't understand. I have a lot of change." He looked confused, so I grabbed the bottom of his sweatshirt and told him to hold it like a hammock. Then I started shoveling handfuls of change into it, handful after handful, and his eyes grew wider in disbelief. Just when he thought I was finished, I switched to the other pocket. The sound of the change echoed between the buildings, and we both started laughing uncontrollably. Finally, I was done. He thanked me and waddled off, looking like a pregnant woman, while I headed to class. The next day was bright and sunny. I parked my car at the church and started walking, a big smile on my face. He met me at the corner, also smiling broadly. He leaned in with a huge grin and said, "Hey buddy, can I get a smoke?" Long pause. "Yeah buddy, you can have a smoke." Story 6. Here's a long, cautionary tale about a roommate experience that includes some petty revenge on an entire friend group. It takes place over 2 years, and I'm spilling all the details, which is why it's so lengthy. If you want to skip to the actual vengeance, head towards the bottom. Almost 2 years ago, I 29F at the time was living with my parents and looking for a place to rent. I had 2 work friends, S20F and T21F, who were also looking for a place. My parents were interested in investing in property, and that's how our new alliance was formed. Neither S nor T had any rental history, and both had poor credit scores. They got to stay with me because I vouched for them. My name was on all the utilities, and I was responsible for managing the bill payments, which is important to remember later. S turned out to be a slob. She'd leave dirty utensils on the counters, dump leftover food in the kitchen sink, and leave pots of food sitting out overnight. She even prepared raw meat directly on the countertops. Yet, she complained about bugs, which, unsurprisingly, disappeared after she moved out. Her small dog wasn't much better. It often peed and pooped in the house, and S would clean it up with nothing more than a dry paper towel. When she moved out, her room was a mess: dried urine stains, dog vomit patches, and even some poop stains on the walls and baseboards. Absolutely disgusting. We also had a group of mutual friends who would show up unannounced at random times to hang out or party. Even when I started working from home, they'd throw parties in the living room without any warning. The next day, there would be used cups, bowls with leftover food, dirty clothes, and trash all over the house, especially candy wrappers, which posed a choking hazard for the pets. Of course, they never cleaned up unless I did it. One takeout cup sat around for 3 months, and I marked it with the date to prove I wasn't losing my mind before I finally threw it out. T, on the other hand, was either always in a bad mood or high as a kite. She had some undiagnosed issues, and when she was upset, it became everyone's problem. The group would often make excuses for her behavior, but I wasn't one to sugarcoat things. Let's circle back to the friend group. I let 2 of them crash at our place separately, K for about a month and B for nearly 3 months. K brought her cat, and B brought so much stuff that it filled our sunroom. I charged them each only $1.50 once. To clarify, neither girl was facing homelessness, they just didn't want to move home or into their boyfriends' places, and I took pity on them. I kept it on the down low because they weren't on the lease, which technically broke the rules. When B finally moved out, she left her belongings behind. For 6 months, her stuff stayed in our shed and sunroom. Despite her having moved into a new house just 10 minutes away, she would still come over often to party and leave a mess. Meanwhile, my boyfriend, who had been staying over more than 4 nights a week for over a year and was also a friend from work, decided to move in. My parents approved, since we were each renting 1 room and he would share mine. The only change was that we'd now split utilities 4 ways instead of 3. This wasn't a secret. At first, S&T seemed fine with it. They already relied on my boyfriend to fix their cars for free, kill bugs, and help with other tasks. But 2 months later, as he was cleaning out his old place, S&T sat me down to tell me they didn't want him to move in, claiming it made them uncomfortable. I initially thought he had done something wrong, but they insisted they loved him and didn't mind if he stayed over every day. They just didn't want him officially on the lease. Their reasons: 1. They liked peeing with the bathroom door open, and 2. They liked walking around in their underwear. Yes, those were their actual reasons. They also claimed I hadn't asked their permission before telling them he was moving in, but only now felt comfortable saying something 2 months later. I apologized but explained that it was too late to reverse the decision. I asked what we could do to make them more comfortable. In person, T was clearly annoyed, but neither had any real suggestions, so I assumed they just wouldn't renew the lease when it ended. Later, I reached out again over text to discuss possible solutions, but things escalated quickly. They tried to make it about money, comparing my boyfriend's move to the friends I had let crash before, claiming he needed to pay for all the time he had spent at the house. When I reminded them that K and B only paid $1.50 each, S&T backtracked, leading me to suspect that they had been secretly collecting more money from K and B during their stays. That argument ended my friendship with T. B and the others continued to show up unannounced, but they mostly ignored me. One friend tried to stay in touch, but I stopped interacting because of the toxic behaviors they enabled. Petty Revenge Part 1. After the fight, S texted me, informing me not asking that she and T had decided to let K crash at our house again, telling me when she would arrive and how long she would stay, several weeks. I shot back that our lease only allowed guests to stay for up to 7 consecutive days, and since we weren't friends anymore, I wouldn't be doing them any more favors. I told them to take it up with the landlords, my parents, but I wasn't covering for them again. Suddenly, K was in a panic, texting me for the first time since the argument. I stood firm, and I couldn't help but laugh at how their own poor planning had backfired. K didn't get to use our house as a free crash pad again. Petty Revenge Part 2. B had left all her stuff in our shed for 6 months, so I put a lock on it. When I asked S to remind B to collect her things, B texted me with an attitude, claiming it was just 3 totes. I sent her a video of all her belongings to prove otherwise and told her to pick them up by the end of the week. She didn't. But the day after I locked the shed, suddenly, she needed the code. I set the code to I win. I also claimed a hoodie B had left behind for months and started throwing out the dirty socks and underwear left around the house. I didn't know whose they were, but I was done dealing with them. I also reported B for using our address for mail without permission, suspecting she had kept it on file to receive benefits. She could use one of her real friends' addresses instead. Petty Revenge Part 3. Not long after all of this, T, S, and K found a house to rent together. S and T broke our lease and gave only 14 days' notice, even though the contract required 30. They left the place a mess, holes in the walls, spoiled food in the fridge, and now they're avoiding my parents, who they still owe rent to. My parents have all the text and the lease to back up their claims, and they're preparing to take legal action. Whether or not they'll win in court, this will follow S and T for years. When they need to rent from a real landlord, they're gonna have a hard time. Meanwhile, I'm surprisingly so much happier and less stressed living in this big house with just my boyfriend and our pets. It's cleaner, calmer, doesn't smell like smoke anymore, and we've even been able to manage the bills on our own just fine. Since I paid off some debts, my monthly expenses haven't even changed.